The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Karen Cho with Steve Sedgwick, and these are your headlines. President Trump urges Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Vladimir Putin to agree to one-on-one talks in a bid to end the war in Ukraine, following Monday's marathon day of diplomacy with European leaders at the White House.
Ultimately, this is a decision that can only be made by President Zelenskyy and by the people of Ukraine working also together in agreement with President Putin. And I just think that's very good things are going to come of it.
The US leader pledges to coordinate security guarantees for Kyiv, but stresses the burden will fall mainly on Europe in helping Ukraine defend itself from any future aggression. And in corporate news, Softbank announces a surprise $2 billion investment in troubled chipmaker Intel, as the Trump administration reportedly looks to take a 10% stake by converting CHIPS Act grants into equity. We've got a big segment here, and we've luckily got Sylvia on set to talk about it as well. But one thing that I noticed straight away yesterday, the optics, and I know that you spot a lot of these things more than I ever do, the optics were so much better all round for Zelensky's return to the Oval Office. It was extraordinary. He had put on a suit of sorts for the Trump team who'd criticised him so aggressively. And even the man, I don't know if you remember, there was a reporter who criticised aggressively back in February the way that Zelenskyy was dressed, even though I'm sure that same reporter wouldn't have criticised Winston Churchill when he wore a boiler suit in the 1940s, but that's another issue at this White House meeting with Roosevelt. But actually, Zelenskyy and that man actually had a bit of a joke between them, and Zelenskyy turned around and said, well, you're wearing the same suit as you wore back in February.
Wasn't very favourable about the actual suit as well.
So I think straight away, and I think optics are very, very important as well. They mean a lot to Trump and the administration, how things look as well, how they seem to the public as well. So straight away, the meeting yesterday got off on the right foot.
Yeah, a lot of niceties and some more gratitude, I think, coming through from the Ukrainian president. That was noted.
They were always grateful, Karen. They were always. They said thank you 1,000 times to the Americans. But the point is, that was obviously they just decided to beat a stick with him in February.
Well, I think there were a lot of learnings after that outing.
Yeah, you're right.
And there's no way Zelenskyy was going to go in unprepared. Hence all the meetings with the Europeans early on to prepare him as well. And I think that the Europeans had their day, didn't they? I mean, it seemed like a lot of this previously has been about Putin and Trump, but I think the Europeans very much carried their force into that meeting yesterday.
You're so right. Critics will say it's sycophancy and it's fawning to the US president. Others will say this is what realpolitik looks like, okay? For Europeans, including Zelenskyy, they've learned a lot of lessons in the last 7 months in how to deal with Trump, haven't they? So, the US president met with Ukrainian President Volodomyr Zelenskyy, as we mentioned, and European leaders in the White House yesterday for talks on how to end the more than 3-year war in Ukraine. Agenda items including security guarantees, military aid, and the possibility of a meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. In a post on Truth Social, Mr. Trump said he spoke with Putin to begin arrangements for the meetings. The US president suggested the leaders of Russia and Ukraine would meet first, followed by a trilateral summit which included him. Speaking alongside Mr. Trump in the Oval Office, Zelenskyy indicated his readiness for a trilateral meeting.
We need to stop this war, to stop Russia, and we need support American and European partners. And we will do our best for this. I think we show that we are strong people, and we supported the idea of the United States, of personally of President Trump, to stop this war, to make diplomatic way of finishing this war, and we are ready for trilateral, as President said. This is a good signal about trilateral. I think this is very good.
Security guarantees for a post-war Ukraine were also discussed. Trump said Putin has agreed Russia would accept such measures, which he called a significant step. In terms of provisions, the US president put the onus primarily on Kyiv's European allies, saying they would take a lot of the burden, but the US would assist them, adding in a post on Truth Social, that Washington would provide coordination. Trump, however, did not rule out putting US troops on the ground as a guarantee, instead hinting at an upcoming announcement on the topic. Trump expressed optimism that an agreement could be reached around security, which would deter future aggression in Ukraine.
The Alaska summit reinforced my belief that while difficult, peace is within reach, and I believe that in a very significant step, President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key points that we need to consider, and we're going to be considering that at the table also, like who will do what, essentially. I'm optimistic that collectively we can reach an agreement that would deter any future aggression against Ukraine, and I actually think there won't be. I think that's even overrated, largely overrated, but we're going to find out. And I think that the European nations are going to take a lot of the burden. We're going to help them, and we're going to make it very secure.
As it looks to gain security guarantees from Washington, Kyiv has reportedly proposed buying $100 billion of US weapons with financing provided by Europe. This according to the FT. They mentioned Patriot missile systems, of course, which are so pivotal for the defence of Ukraine. Now, the proposals would also reportedly see a $50 billion agreement for drone production with Ukrainian companies. And of course, who's at the forefront of drone production in the world? Well, it's the combatants and their allies, isn't it? There are still gaps on the path to peace between Moscow and Kyiv, with territorial concessions the most notable. Putin has insisted Russia retain the roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory it currently controls, something Zelensky has repeatedly rejected. When asked yesterday if he would concede territory, and I guess the point here is more territory, if it could end the war sooner, Zelensky did not answer directly. Speaking after meetings, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte outlined the discussions surrounding security guarantees.
What we are discussing here is not NATO membership. What we are discussing here is Article 5 type of security guarantees for Ukraine, and what they exactly will entail will now be more specifically discussed.
So look, it's great to have Sylvia on set with us as well, who is, of course, the celebrated anchor, the award-winning anchor of Europe Early Edition. You are award-winning.
Yes.
You are an award-winning journalist, which is more than I've ever been in my life, apart from my Cub proficiency badge. So look, you are our expert on the Commission, on Brussels, on European leaders. You've spoken to more commissioners than I've had hot dinners. Tell us a little bit about what you think happened yesterday.
So I spoke to several European leaders on Sunday evening and officials trying to understand what exactly are you going to try to achieve in Washington, D.C. So then we can actually assess what is the outcome and how Europe is feeling about it. So there were three things that Europe wanted to achieve, and this also includes the UK in this context. They wanted to get confirmations on security guarantees. They wanted to make sure that there was a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. And they wanted a third thing that is harder to achieve, but the so-called stop killing, the killing in Ukraine, i.e. they would like to see a ceasefire. So if I break it down, when it comes to security guarantees, the Europeans did obtain some sort of confirmation from Donald Trump that there will be what he called coordination from the United States. We don't know exactly how that's going to look like, but it was an important moment.
A non-NATO Article 5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's similar. They say it's similar to Article 5, but let's not kid ourselves. This is not NATO membership whatsoever, right? When it comes to a potential meeting between Zelensky and Putin, there is a movement from the United States to try to make this happening. We don't know if it's going to take place, but at least the Europeans got the President of the United States to say that he's working towards that. And last but not least, when it comes to a potential ceasefire, Europe does want to see an initial truce before the potential full peace deal. Of course, that's not the message from the Trump administration thus far, but let's see how these things will unfold, because the German leader did make the point that he would like to see, once Zelensky and Putin meet, he would like to see that truce taking place. I had a chance to speak to a former foreign minister, Gabrielius Landesbergis. He's joined Europe Early Edition earlier this morning, and here's his comment on the assessment of what happened in DC yesterday.
What came out of the meeting was that Europe was asking the US to continue their assistance, to ask for a ceasefire, to assist any stationing of troops, which is, we talked about this. And then even some of the leaders were kind of talking, well, maybe some of the territories might be lost, but that's a reality. So that doesn't sound like Europe, finding its strength. It's more like Europe agreeing that, okay, we are in a very weak position. We basically have to please President Trump as much as we can because we have very little to put on the table. So unfortunately, at least from my perspective, Europe has not yet found its strength, its ability to create leverage.
So that comment is also very important because we've discussed this before. There was a suggestion at one point that perhaps Europe was not, or the EU, I should say, actually, is not part of the conversations, is struggling to have a say in what happens in Ukraine next. I was asking the former minister whether there was a bit of a change in that dynamic with what we have witnessed, particularly in DC yesterday. But his opinion is actually that no, that the EU is still struggling to get a say around the table, and that ultimately it's very hard for the EU to be listened to in an international scene. But let's see how these things will unfold, because for the time being, at least, we have witnessed better relations between the Europeans and Donald Trump, and that has supported Ukraine. I mean, you were talking about optics at the start of the show. The optics of seeing 7 leaders from Europe traveling to DC with Zelensky is huge, is very meaningful. And one European official did tell me over the weekend, this is very relevant because first and foremost, they wanted to avoid what happened back in February when Zelensky got criticized in the Oval Office.
Yeah, also using some of their language to appeal to the president, seeing the Finnish president Stubb talk about the comparison of what they were dealing with here, the defense line, saying a bastion against the Huns in terms of some of those key regions in Donetsk that they want to hold on to. In terms of what we're seeing on the language here, I thought it was really interesting that just trying to tackle the use of the word ceasefire, Trump trying to talk European leaders away from that terminology. Why is that so significant, number one? But number two, when it comes to a reassurance force on the ground, why that would be useful in terms of creating some sort of status quo so the Russians don't provide further incursions on the ground?
So when it comes to ceasefire, once we had the outcome from the Alaska summit, it was very clear that after having conversations with President Putin, that the President of the United States became of the opinion that we should pursue a total peace deal and should forget an intermediate deal that would lead to a ceasefire that ultimately may not last. From a European perspective, they think about this in a different way. They think that that's necessary. So hence the language and the different language that we witnessed in DC, and in particular from the President of the United States, when it comes to the security guarantees. This is huge. I mean, we can't talk about peace in Ukraine without discussing security guarantees, because it is very clear that Ukraine is not going to get a NATO membership, at least in the near future. So ultimately, how can Europe support that? It is very clear that the EU and the UK came together to say, we are here to support Ukraine. We are here to provide those security guarantees, but we cannot do it without American intelligence. We cannot do it without the United States. So they need some sort of backing from Donald Trump. So you have this back and forth where European leaders are telling Donald Trump, listen, we are here to do our part. It's very similar to what we witnessed in the conversations in NATO, and you were at the NATO summit. We are here, we're going to pay our fair share, we're going to support Ukraine, but we ultimately can't do it without you also being with us some shape or form.
Can I bring in the defence names a little bit as well? They're all down a couple of percent yesterday. In fact, exactly 2% for the case of Renk as well. Look, this is a very highly rated sector with a huge thematic which is going to back up its earnings going forward as well. But I mean, it's I would suggest, and again, I'm no stock picker or no analyst, that this is a knee-jerk reaction to rapprochement, to the hopes of peace. And if that's the price, then I'm sure the shareholders of defence names will feel mixed about it. But the fact of the matter is, over the medium to longer term, there is nothing in any of these conversations that means that Europe is going to be spending less on defence. In fact, all of these, with security guarantees, the burden being taken by the Europeans, plus their own rebuilding of their own defence as well, everything means that it's a medium to longer term story, regardless of whether the war has a peaceful solution or unfortunately becomes an ongoing conflict.
The moves we are witnessing at this stage, they are an indication of some of the short-term discussions, but they are not changing the broader narrative as you highlighted there. Of course, we can discuss valuations, we can discuss where we have started from the lows that we had back in the day for European defense names. But going forward, there's nothing here that suggests that there will be a change in rhetoric from Europe. Who is going to pay for Ukraine to buy weapons from the United States?
I've got an answer. The $300 billion worth of Russian assets held in Brussels.
That will help, for sure. But ultimately, it is Europe both supporting all of these efforts. So you have Europe, okay, the money ultimately might be going to US military equipment, but the whole defense narrative in Europe has not changed. And we know that there are specific buckets of cash that are meant to go to European defense companies too. So the medium to long-term trend has not changed, will not change, even if we see a ceasefire.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's been a chorus in terms of that voice that we've heard about the defence commitment and how the spending continues from this point. And we've tackled it from just about every angle, from the defence companies to European leaders to ambassadors to those who've been critiquing what's happened. I mean, everybody is saying exactly the same thing. So thank you so much. Now, coming up on the show, Softbank invests $2 billion in Intel as the Trump administration reportedly considers a new way of taking a stake in the troubled chipmaker. Plus, Novo Nordisk halves the US price of its weight loss drug Ozempic. And we'll take a look at the earnings with the CEO of office space provider IWG. That's Mark Dixon, so stay tuned for that conversation. It was somewhat of a go-nowhere session yesterday. Markets really just treading water. And don't forget all the major events we've been talking about, the geopolitics, the optics around the war in Ukraine, whether it can be solved, the European leaders with Zelenskyy himself at the White House. And later this week, we count down to Jackson Hole in Wyoming. So the market looking very closely at any breakthrough on some of the monetary policy discussions around tariffs. Of note, the earnings later on today from the retailers, where they're starting to see that impact and what it means on margins, but the consumer behavior itself. So markets just holding back in terms of direction yesterday, and you could see it flat for the S&P 500, slight tilt weaker for the Dow, slight tilt higher for the Nasdaq, really, but no real progression for these major boards. In terms of the Asian markets, in contrast, this is how it looks across the region. Slightly stronger ranges, as you can see. Cosby in particular giving back some territory. A downbeat session elsewhere for Japanese stocks that have been rallying early in the week, so giving back 0.4%. Slightly softer range on that Hong Kong market of 0.2% versus Shanghai that's just creeping higher. So slightly bigger moves we're seeing across those Asian boards. Let's get up to speed with the European markets. Yesterday, we were slightly firmer on the benchmark, the Stoxx Europe 600, thanks to some heavy lifting from the FTSE 100. Elsewhere, just patches of weakness cropping up across on the French stock market in particular, and a little bit weaker on the DAX. So this morning as we get going, we're looking to creep higher. But don't forget, yesterday we moved positive, but very quickly slipped into red territory. Again, a nod to some of the risks out there in the markets. Let's take a look at those US futures. The picture this morning, again, looking just a little bit soft, a little bit weaker in terms of those ranges, giving back some territory, ahead of the headline risk this week, namely Jackson Hole and what we may hear around Fed policy, Steve.
Did you take a look at this S&P Global Ratings statement? And I would forgive you if you haven't, because it goes on and on and on. But there was one key word, if we're students of tautology, which I thought was absolutely pivotal from this as well. It's the ratings agency reads, coming as I speak now as well. And that is meaningful. The word meaningful was in there, and bear with me, everybody, as well, because we're doing the analysis so you don't have to as well. It's basically a reaffirming of the AA+ rating from S&P for the United States. Outlook remains stable on steady, albeit high deficits. So they're not worried about the deficits as such. They don't like them, but they're saying it's fine. But the thing that I thought was interesting there was, amid the rise in effective tariff rates, we expect meaningful tariff revenue to generally offset weaker fiscal outcomes. Well, that's an incredible positive for the US balance sheet that actually we are going to be seeing. And again, you and I have spoken many, many times, many experts about, we just don't know where the final tariff levels are going to land. And in fact, even if final tariff levels will ever be final, because, policy may change quite quickly as well. But if one of the key rating agencies, and we'll take them at their word on this one, thinks that it's going to be meaningful, then that money it's welcome for the Federal Reserve coffers with a big fiscal deficit. But, and I don't mean to be curmudgeonly about this, that money has to come from somewhere. And that money won't come from the people exporting into the US, it will come at the point of entry from the people buying the goods. And I know that people don't like the idea of this, but it's coming from the people buying the goods. Now, and again, referring to Jan Hatzius and Goldman Sachs, will it be the consumer or will it be the companies or a combination of both? And we've got a brilliant retail section coming up as well, because we're going to get a real insight to see what the retailers are doing in terms of how they are paying for this and maybe offsetting some of the costs.
The consequence and the implications are quite key as to where it lands. But I think from the original conversations we're having around the tariffs, whether you could bank on the revenue, and the conversation point then was whether you saw retaliation. And we know that simply hasn't happened. Countries have rolled over. So whether the revenue is bankable from a ratings perspective, I think they're now getting clarity that it is, that we're not going to get the pushback from other nations. As to whether it tanks the economy and causes some sort of growth consequence, that's a different picture.
You're right. I mean, do you all remember early on in this where Carney, in the early battles with the US over tariffs, and I don't even know how it's finished yet, I mean, it has finished, came to Europe and the administration straight away started saying, don't you guys gang up on us, pretty much words to that effect as well. So it's fascinating. The tariff retribution hasn't happened. Maybe, and again, people have just said maybe it's just better to pay the price and just have better terms of trade or better relationship with the US.
Well, some commentators couldn't believe that countries didn't work together in lockstep as a collective to push back against Trump. And I think that's what would have caused some sort of collective bargaining to avoid the tariff escalation. But the individual, and I think, Trump was very, very clever. He sent letters, specific letters to countries. So the ability to come together and bargain collectively was really taken away with these individual letters that were fired off from the White House.
And that wonderful board that Mr. Lutnick held up for us in the White House garden, just showing everything extraordinary. Right, let me get back to the story and we'll move on. S&P has affirmed its AA rating, AA plus rating on the US sovereign debt, saying it expects tariff revenue to offset the fiscal impact, as I said, of what President Trump described as his big, beautiful bill. S&P also kept its outlook for the world's largest economy at stable. The ratings agency said it expects net general government debt to near 100% of GDP amid structurally rising non-discretionary interest and aging-related expenditure, and that bipartisan cooperation to lower deficits remains elusive, I should say. Anyway, wow, look at these guests. We have got the Treasury Secretary on this channel, 12:30 BST. That's not all. No, the aforementioned Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, will be joining CNBC at 1400 BST. Okay, quick one for you. Apple will reportedly no longer be forced to provide a backdoor to US user data in the United Kingdom. Well, that's a change. The US Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, made the announcement on X, adding London had agreed to drop the mandate to keep American data private. A UK order from earlier this year had been incredibly controversial. It had meant that the tech giant had to disable its encryption for some user information. A UK government spokesperson said they do not comment on operational matters. Well, they did comment on operational matters. They commented when they opened the door. So surely they can comment when they're shutting the door. That's disingenuous from the Brits. Right, sorry.
Let's push on to the retailers. I mentioned earlier that we've got some big report cards crossing this week. Well, the US retailers will deliver those latest report cards, with traders watching out for any impact of the US tariffs on bottom lines, as well as commentary around the outlook for the second half. Front-loading strategies will also be in focus on earnings season as retailers rush to ship popular items into the US ahead of tariff deadlines. I'm calling this a 360 as you look at Home Depot to Target, Lowe's, Walmart. Very different idea of how the retail basket is performing. So it's going to give us a sense of any behavioural change and just what those margins are doing along with the pass-through to consumers. Now, the Trump administration is reportedly in talks to take a 10% stake in chipmaker Intel by converting grants into equity. Intel is currently set to receive almost $11 billion from the Biden-era CHIPS Act, which the government is now considering converting into equity, according to Bloomberg. The move, if confirmed, would make the US government Intel's largest shareholder. Separately, Intel is also receiving a $2 billion capital injection from Softbank. The equity investment will see Softbank become Intel's sixth largest shareholder, with a Reuters source saying the Japanese tech investment giant is not seeking a board seat or committing to buy Intel chips. Our colleague Lin Lin filed this report.
Softbank Group is continuing to double down on chip investments with a $2 billion injection into Intel. The purchase at $23 a share represents a small discount to the company's closing price and would give Softbank just under a 2% stake in the US chip maker. This comes as the Japanese investor has made a series of significant AI-related bets in recent quarters, from its Stargate data center project and commitments to OpenAI to investments in NVIDIA and TSMC. It's certainly welcome news for the beleaguered US chip maker and comes as reports suggest the US government may also consider taking a 10% stake in Intel. For Softbank, it marks another step in expanding its US footprint. In a statement, Masayoshi Son said the investment reflects his belief that advanced semiconductor manufacturing and supply will continue to expand in the US, with Intel playing a critical role. Its shares, though, after scaling new heights in recent days, fell by as much as 5% during Asian trade. Lin Lin, CNBC Business News.